to Board Games with Scott. I'm Scott Nicholson, and I'll be your host for the next few minutes as I talk you through some of the variety of types of board games that are out today. When many people talk about board games, they tend to think of one game in particular. Monopoly. Now, maybe not Muppets Monopoly, but something in the Monopoly line. I'm not going to talk a lot about Monopoly. I'm going to instead talk about lots of other games that give you, well, a lot more fun and enjoyment for the time that you're actually going to spend with the game. That's the biggest problem with Monopoly, is while it has some mechanics of auction and moving around the board, it tends to take far too long for what it is. I'll be talking about games today in 4 different categories. I'll be talking about party games, which are light games that tend to work with big groups of people. You tend to not have to think very hard. They're sort of silly, fun stuff, maybe a good accompaniment to a party, to maybe you do better when you drink. I'll talk about family games. Family games are lighter board games. They're a little bit more to them than a party game, but they're good for a mixed group of people, gamers and non-gamers. I'll talk about Euro games, or light strategy games, or family strategy games. This is the type of game that is my favorite, and it will be most of what I'm featuring here on Board Games with Scott. And finally, I'll talk about heavier games, some war games and things like that. And so this broad spectrum goes from light to heavy. The party games are light, and the war games are heavy. Now, when I say talk about the weight, what do I mean? Well, I mean that a heavier game is one that's going to have more interlocking systems, more things that you need to focus on in order to do well in the game. They tend to be longer. A heavier game tends to be a longer game. One problem with light games is when they go too long, because you run out of interesting things to do. Monopoly, for example, as I mentioned earlier, is far too long for its weight. So I'm going to go through some sample games in each category and talk a little bit about them to give you an idea of when I use these terms on my Board Games with Scott video blog, you'll have an idea of what I'm talking about. The other thing I'll be talking about that these games have in common are game mechanics. For example, Monopoly, roll and move is a game mechanic. You roll the dice and you move your pawn. There's an auction game mechanic as well. You can bid on something. So many of these games have different game mechanics, and I'll talk about those mechanics as I describe the games. When we tend to talk about games, we talk about them using those two variables. We talk about the mechanics that are involved, and we talk about the weight of the game. So it's a heavy game, a heavy roll and move game, for example, would not be a hard one to come up with, I think. But I'll talk about these sort of things, give you some examples. I'm going to actually talk through all of these games you see in front of you. It's a small part of my collection, and give you an idea of what these games are that I'm talking about in Board Games with Scott. So with that, I think we'll take a look at the party games. So the first type of game I'm going to talk about are party games. These are party games I've got in front of me. These are lighter games. They tend to be kind of silly and lighthearted. For example, in Why Did the Chicken? It's a party game where you are trying to make up the best punchline to a joke. What's the difference between a rock and a firefly, for example? And everyone writes the best punchline, and then one person selects the best punchlines to the joke. So this really gets your creative juices flowing. Apples to Apples is a game you might have heard of. It's a game that's gotten a lot of press. It's a good party game. In Apples to Apples, everyone has a hand of cards that say have nouns and things on them. And one adjective or adverb is played in the middle of the board. And everyone then tries to come up with something that matches that term. So you might have weird as the word in the middle of the board, and you look through here and you play a card that says, Scott Nicholson, and you might win. Each person, there's a judge who decides what's the best match each time. Time's Up is one of the best charades type games that are out there. And Time's Up is a 3-round game. You might have heard of it called Celebrities is the home version, but in Time's Up you've got cards that have famous people. There's 3 rounds to the game. In the first round you can do anything you want except say the name of the person to try and get them to come up with a name. In the second round, though, you can say one word but do as much acting as you want. And the third round you can only act. So it's an interesting game of attaching mannerisms or actions to people. A lot of fun. Cluzzle, which is for clay puzzle, is it's a good party game for up to 6 people. What you're doing in Cluzzle is you're attempting to craft clues out of clay that describe something. You don't want it to be too obvious, because if someone guesses yours right away, you don't get many points. But you don't want it to be too obscure, because if no one guesses it throughout the game, then you don't get any points. Each round you have to ask some yes and no questions about the things you haven't figured out yet, and then take a guess. It's a very clever party game for people who want to script. Now here's an example of a trivia game, Wits and Wagers. This is a fairly recent game that I like a lot. It combines gambling and trivia. It's kind of a neat game in that you don't have to know the answer to do well in the game. You just have to know who at the table would know the answer. Or you have to enjoy figuring out odds based upon the answer. All the answers in this trivia game are numeric. And so what happens is there's a question like how many bones are in the human body. Everyone writes down a guess. And then you put the guesses down from lowest to highest. And then you place bets on what you think is right. And the further away you are from the middle of what people have said, the more you're going to win on your bet. So it's a very clever trivia game. Ubongo is a timed puzzle game. There's a number of party games that are timed games. So this is a timed puzzle game where everyone's working a puzzle where you have to fit 3 or 4 shapes into a certain larger shape as quickly as you can against the timer. And the first person to succeed gets more points than people who finish later. So it's kind of a panic puzzle game. And the final game I'll talk about, which is an example of dexterity games, is Via Palette. This game is about building towers up to the sky, and each player has a number of pillars or columns that are of their color. And on your turn, you're going to pull out a column of your color and put it on top of the structure. And what will happen is as the thing builds higher and higher, some of your columns will be left behind because they have to hold up the structure. If you pull it out, everything would collapse. And the goal is to have the most columns on the top level of the structure when the tower does eventually collapse. There's a lot of dexterity games along these lines. So these are just a few sample types of party games. For more information on lots of different party games, visit boardgamegeek.com. Board Game Geek is one of the best communities out there for discussing these games. And I'll talk about some party games throughout the run of Board Games with Scott. The next category of games I'm going to talk about are family games. These are lighter games. They tend to have some of the same elements as the Euro games that I'll be talking about later, but are good introductions to these concepts. They're a little more in depth than the party games, but they're ones that you could pull out with any group of people and get playing fairly quickly. And I'll talk through some of them now. Havoc, which is a fairly new game of the 100 Years' War. This game is basically like poker, really. On your turn, you're building up a big hand of cards, and then when someone declares a battle by screaming, "Havoc!" then everyone plays the best poker hand they can, and the top poker hand wins the war. Saboteur is a clever little card game by Z-Man Games. In this game, before you start, you pass out cards which will make either players on the good guys team working for the dwarves, or one of a handful of saboteurs who are trying to screw things up. Then you play the game, and that's secret. No one knows who is on the good team and who's on the bad team. And in the game, you're trying to dig a tunnel from the entrance to a treasure chest and find the treasure chest that has the gold. So people who are the saboteurs will be trying to lead the path away from the chests. People who are the good guys are trying to get the chests. If the saboteurs prevent the good guys from getting to a chest, then the saboteurs get points. The good guys get points if they find the chest. So it's a clever little game with unknown sides. Bonanza is a classic bean game. It's about bean farming. Yay! Bean farming extreme. In Bonanza, you're trading beans with each other. It's a trading game. That's really at the heart of this game is trading with each other. It's got some bizarre mechanisms, but it's a good introduction to the concept of a trading game. Mamma Mia! Mamma Mia is a game about making pizza. And you get pizza orders that you're trying to fulfill by playing ingredient cards. It's a memory game, actually. But it's a different type of memory game, so you're trying to remember what ingredients have been played so that you can play an order that will be fulfilled. So it's a game based upon the mechanic of memory. Diamant is a great pressure luck game. I've heard this is the German version. I've heard there's another version coming out in the United States soon. In Diamant, it's all about going deeper and deeper into the diamond mine, gathering up gems before horrible things happen and you die. So it's a game about pressing your luck. You're trying to see how far you want to go before you run away with whatever gems that you've gotten so far and run away back to camp. So it's a good example of a light pressure luck game. Poison is a fairly new game, and in Poison you have 3 bubbling kettles. It's a card game, really. You're playing numeric cards that have colors, and you're trying to make the kettles bubble by playing the total of cards up to, but not over 13. If you play a numbered card that makes a kettle go over 13, it bubbles over, and you have to take all the cards except for the one you just played. So you're forced to take cards, so you're pushing the kettles closer and closer to their boiling point. The clever bit in the game is that the player who takes the most points in a card color doesn't have to score any points in that color. So it's a good thing. They don't take any of the penalty. You don't want cards in the game. So it's kind of a neat screw your neighbor type game where you try and force them to take cards. That's Life is actually, it's a roll and move game. It takes the basic mechanism where you roll a die and you move one of your pawns, but it adds quite a bit. It's got a board that as you land on these tiles, if you're the last one to leave a tile, you have to take the tile, then it's points. So it's the game that puts itself away as you play. There are negative tiles, which you don't want, because they're negative points, and positive tiles, which you do want. And then there are tiles that flip a positive
Negative to a positive.
That's pretty much, there's a bit more to the game, but it's a very clever roll and move game that starts out very easy, but gets more interesting as the game goes on. So it's a good game to introduce people to these deeper games. Ingenious is a nice combination of puzzle and dominoes. You've got tiles that have colors on them, and you're going to play them on the board, and when you play colors next to other colors, you get points. And so on your turn, you play a tile and draw a tile. It's a fairly basic game. It's got a clever mechanism where you have points in different colors you're collecting, red points and orange points and blue points. At the end of the game, your score is equal to whatever you got the fewest number of points in. So if you only got 2 blue points, but 7 orange and 8 red points, your score is only 2. So it's a game where you have to balance your plays. One of my favorite gateway games is Blockus or Blockus. And what you're doing in Blockus is you're playing small translucent pieces on a board. It looks great. And you're attempting to, it's kind of like if you remember the movie Tron, the Tron light cycles, you're trying to play as many of your pieces as you can. Each one can only touch the pieces you've played previously diagonally. So they can't be right next to each other, but they can touch diagonally. So you go zooming around the board, and everyone else is zooming around the board, and it's a lot of fun. It's a good introductory game. So that's an example of some family games. These are lighter games that have a little bit more to them than, say, Monopoly or Sorry, and might get people ready to move up into the next category of games, which I'll talk about, the light strategy games. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the biggest part of my collection, a lot of what's going to be going on in board games with Scott, and that's the Euro games, or the light strategy games. The reason why they're called Euro games is that about 10 years or so, in 95, this game, Settlers of Catan, made its way over to America from Germany. It was a very popular game. It was the first one in this ilk of Euro games. And many of the games you see here originated in Europe. So they get the name Euro games. Now, there are games that have come out of Europe that would qualify for some of the other categories. Party games, family games, or war games. So the term Euro games is actually not a good one to use for this whole class of games, but you'll hear it. I like the term light strategy games because that's what these games tend to be. And again, even within Euro games, I've divided these into 3 groups as I talk about them. Gateway games, which are games that tend to be a little lighter, fewer rules to deal with, are a good introduction to this type of game for people not comfortable with this genre. Heavier games, these will be a little meatier, and very heavy games. These games require a lot of thought, involve a lot of interacting, a lot of different systems going on at the same time. And again, I'll say these categories are subjective. I'm just kind of making them up as I go along. But when I do my reviews in board games with Scott, this is what I'll be referring to, whether it's a lightweight Euro game or a heavyweight Euro game. So, let me talk about these games briefly. As I mentioned earlier, the Settlers of Catan, one of the gateway games. A lot of people who entered this hobby started with this game. This game involves resource management and involves a lot of trading with each other. You have places on the board, so there's a bit of placement and maneuvering around the board and blocking other people. But so as you notice, again, I'm going to refer to these games by weight and by mechanics. So this game is mainly, there's a lot of trading, negotiation, and some planning ahead. Mystery of the Abbey is a deduction game. Kind of if people like Clue, they might like this game as the next step. You've got different types of abbots. One of the abbots did it, and you're trying to figure out who did it. You've got fat abbots and thin abbots, and you've got all sorts of different aspects, and you get to ask questions of each other. So, how many fat abbots have you seen? So this game has a lot of theme to it. It's got a lot more going on than Clue, and so it's an interesting deduction game. Carcassonne is a good example of a tile-laying game. Carcassonne, what you're doing in it is you're playing tiles that have fields and roads and bits of towns, and you're connecting them all together. So each turn, you take a tile and you play it somewhere on the board. And then this game also introduced something called a meeple, for miniature people. The meeple are their little bitty wood people, and the term of meeple stuck for gaming bits. This game came out in 2000, so we've had about 5-6 years now of people talking about whatever you are moving around the board with as your meeple. But this was the game that started the meeple concept. Ticket to Ride was Game of the Year in 2004. It's got a rummy base where you're collecting sets of cards, but it's also got some interesting elements where you're connecting cities across the board, and everyone has a secret goal. And so you have a set of secret goal cards, and if you can achieve the secret goal cards, you get bonus points. If you can't achieve them, you lose those bonus points, though. So you are not only trying to collect sets, but trying to watch what other people are doing, and trying to stop them from getting in your way. Now this was my gateway game. This was the game that I first played of this genre that got me into it. Adele Verpflichtet is the German name. That's the copy I have. It's also come out under the names of By Hook or By Crook, and most recently called Hoity Toity. You can get it as that. And this game introduced the concept of blind selection, where a lot of the game focuses around everyone has the same set of actions, and I'm trying to pick an action that will benefit me, but that doesn't get in the way of what you're doing, and I might be trying to interfere with you or something like that. But I have, for example, I can start out by going to the auction house to go and buy more art, or I can go and show my art and try and have the best art show. And so if I think everyone else is going to show their art, I want to go to the auction house because I'll be the only person bidding. So it was one of the early games that had that mechanism where you are trying to predict what other people are going to do. Manila is a gambling game, really, at heart. This is a game where it's got, I compare it to roulette. There's a number of different bets on the board. On your turn, you can place a bet, and then what will happen is you'll get to see some of the outcome towards those bets. And you can actually bid, so there's a bit of auction, for the right to slightly manipulate the way that the roulette wheel is going to come out, if you will. So if you like that concept, if you like roulette, if you like gambling, this is a game that's a good gateway game. This is an out-of-print game, Rette sich wer kann, also known as Lifeboat Game. You can get, there's a new game that has the same mechanism called Mall of Horror. The idea of this game is that it has the mechanism of voting. You really don't have anything to vote with in this game. You don't have any bribes to give people. It's all about how well you can convince everyone else not to throw you out of the lifeboat. And so this is a game based on elections. So Mall of Horror, if you like that idea of it's all about negotiation, then take a look for Mall of Horror by Asmodee Games. But this, the lifeboat game, Rette sich wer kann, is the classic gateway game about voting. Acquire. This is one of many versions. This is a game that's been out for some time, made by Sid Saxon. This is a game about stock markets. And this is one of the earlier games, big gateway game about stock markets, buying and selling at the right times. It's actually, despite the dry-sounding theme, where you've got chains of hotels and you're trying to make them bigger and bigger, this is a game I've had good luck introducing to a lot of non-gamers. It's an engaging way to play with stock markets and build your hotel chains and things like that. It's also a game to help introduce a concept that you don't own stuff on the board. You just own stock in stuff on the board. So it's not necessarily your hotel chain on the board. You just have stock in it. Other people can buy stock in it as well. So that's a good light stock game. Now we're going to move up a bit. These are heavier games. Again, these games tend to be focused on one large mechanism, maybe with some other sub-mechanisms. But I wouldn't call these gateway games. These would be games to play after people have played some of the ones I've just shown you. El Grande is one of the classics. It was one of the first games to use the concept of area control, where you have a map with lots of little spaces, and your goal is to have the most pieces in a space on the board. And so the game is about moving other people's pieces out, putting more of yours in, and having first, second, or third place in the most number of people in each space on the board. So this was the first area control game. Raw, which has just recently been re-released. El Grande, by the way, is out of print right now. Should be coming out soon. Raw has recently been re-released. Raw is an excellent bidding game. In Raw, you're using tiles to bid, the numerical tiles from 1 to 16. Everyone has a set of different numbers, and you're bidding on different goods as they come out of the bag. This game has some neat little timer mechanism that when goods come out of the bag that have a symbol of raw, the game gets one click closer to being over. So there's a bit of panic as you get towards the end of each round of the game when people are saying, you know, oh boy, I'm going to get in trouble if you draw another raw tile. This is a fun bidding game. Himalaya is an example of a programmed move game. Similar to another game called Robo Rally. This one's a little bit more strategic, a little less chaotic. In this game, the mechanic I'm talking about is where ahead of time everyone selects 6 moves. So you may say, I'm going to move on the gravel road, and then I'm going to move on the river, and then I'm going to move on the paved road. And you choose some moves ahead of time, and then I'm going to go to the village and pick stuff up. Everyone chooses 6 moves, and then you reveal them, and everyone moves simultaneously. So it's a game of programming 6 steps ahead of time and trying to figure out what everyone else is going to do so that you stay out of their way and get the most benefit. Arkham Horror is an example of an adventure game. Talisman is another example of this type of adventure game. In these games, you take on roles, and you are heading out to deal with a situation. In this case, this game is set in the Cthulhu mythos, Lovecraft's Cthulhu world, where you're a group of folks in the 20s desperately trying to stop some unknown horror. So you're running around, you're gathering weapons and spells, and you're jumping into gates and dealing with the outer world, all before this big evil beastie comes along and eats you up. This is a cooperative game as well. The whole group of players are working together to try and win the game. It's a tough game to win. The last game I'll talk about is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is one of the few games I've actually rated a 10. It has a number of different systems going on. One of the first things one of the things Puerto Rico did is it took the normal stages of a game and broke them up into player roles. So, like in a typical game like this, you may have one action where you buy a building, and another action where you hire some workers, and another action where you produce goods, and another action where you sell goods. And in many games up to this point, you would just do all those actions in turn when it was your go. So you buy buildings, you hire workers, you put the workers in the buildings, you produce goods, you'd sell goods. In Puerto Rico, when it's your turn, you can do one of those things. You say, I want everyone to be able to buy buildings. So you take the buy buildings role. You get to go first, and you get a bit of advantage, and everyone else follows up. And the next person might say, you know, I want to produce goods now. So it breaks apart the stages of a game, makes them very interesting. I highly recommend this game. This is a modern classic. It's one of the top-rated games on Board Game Geek, which is a board game community. Very good game. Now I'm going to move up a bit in weight in some heavier Euro games. Tigris and Euphrates it's also it's a classic. It's one of the top rated games on Board Game Geek. This is a game, as they say, it's a game of culture, crisis, conflict, and civilization. You're playing tiles on the board to connect empires. This is a strategic game where you're going head-to-head, quite often trying to have the best empire. It also had an interesting scoring mechanism where in the game you're attempting to get points in different colors, red points and black points and green points and blue points. The winner of the game is the person who got the most points in the weakest color. So it's an interesting mechanism. You have to be balanced. You can't just be really strong in one color. You have to be balanced. But this is a tough game. It's a very heavy game. There's a lot of thinking you've got to do well in this game. Age of Steam is a game by Martin Wallace about trains, a little heavier than Ticket to Ride. Martin Wallace has designed several train games. An older one called Voldampf was really the precursor to this Age of Steam game. In Age of Steam, you're placing tiles to make train lines. You're delivering goods from one place to another. You're taking roles, like in Puerto Rico, that actually just give you a special ability each turn, and you're bidding on those, so there's some bidding. Money management is difficult. You start this game in the hole, in a deficit, and you have to issue stocks, which puts you deeper in debt, and you claw your way out. It's a heavy game, though. There's a lot going on here. There's another game that's recently out called Railroad Tycoon, which is this concept, but it's a much lighter game. So depending upon who you play with, if you're playing with more gamers, I'd suggest Age of Steam. If you're playing with a mix of gamers and non-gamers, or just family members, look for Railroad Tycoon. It's a more accessible concept of this same game. Now, Power Grid is an interesting game. The reason why I've put it over here in the heavy category is because you're dealing with several different mechanisms at the same time. In Power Grid, first you have an auction, just like in an auction game, where you're bidding on power plants. And then you have a stock market time, where it's like a stock market game, where you're buying goods and making the market price go up for different goods. And then you have a placement turn, where you have a board with either the United States on one side or Europe on the other. And you're connecting different cities around the board. And so you're having to deal with, and you have to deal with money to fund all of this stuff. So you're having to balance all of this together. So there's a lot of different interlocking systems that go together in Power Grid. The final Euro game I'll talk about is one of the granddaddies. D-Mocker. This is a long game. This is a 4 to 5 hour game. It's a game about the German election system. Oh my, how fun. It actually is a lot of fun. It's another game with a lot of different interlocking systems. You've got to try and balance them all with one pot of money. Some neat things about this game are that there are alliances that change from round to round. It's up to 5-player game, and with 5 players you tend to have 2 alliances of 2 and an odd man out. But they shift from turn to turn. Like the German political system, you've got these alliances that work together to win certain elections. If you can ever have a chance to play this game, I highly recommend it. I'll do a review of it here on Board Game with Scott at some point. But it's seen as sort of the granddaddy Euro game. So while this is means a complete list, this is a brief list of some of the types of games in this category. The final type of game I'm going to talk about here are these heavier games, war games. Some people would scoff at me calling these things war games. I don't have a lot of true war games with a bazillion little counters and things like that. I do have some of these games which tend to be seen as more of a hybrid, somewhere between the Euro games I just talked about and a true serious war game. But these tend to be more militaristic in nature. They tend to be fairly heavy and longer games. Diplomacy? Perhaps you've heard of it. This is a classic game. It's an interesting game in that you spend 15 minutes negotiating with each other about where you're going to move on the map. Then everyone writes down their orders in secret, and they're all executed simultaneously. It also has no dice. There's no luck involved. It's all about convincing other people to help you win battles. And, of course, you'll help them win theirs. Another game that sits between Euro games and war games is Wallenstein. In Wallenstein, it's got a big map. You're fighting in Germany over territories. It's an area control game, kind of like El Grande, but it's got this interesting tower. It's this cube tower. And what happens is whenever there's a fight, you just scoop up everyone that's fighting and drop them into this tower. And the tower has all these little levels. And the cubes, some of them drop through out, and some of them get stuck on the levels. You look at whatever dropped through to the bottom, and whichever player has the most there wins the battle. Any others stay there, and if another player's cubes fall out, they stay there to fight another day. So if you do poorly in one battle, you know you'll do better in another battle because some of your cubes are sitting there stuck in that tower, and they'll come out later to help you out. But it's an interesting militaristic game. Friedrich is a interesting game for 4 players. It's a card-driven war game, a very light war game again. This plays in a few hours. And this is a game where there's one player playing against 3 other players. And so one player is more powerful, is in the middle of the board. The other players are all weaker and are trying to work their way in. It's an interesting introduction to the concept of a card-driven war game. And so if you like this, there'll be other war games that you can move into. The final game I'm going to talk about is 7 Ages. 7 Ages is a big military conquest, build up your troops kind of game. The interesting thing about this particular game is that you're controlling, depending upon the number of players, 2 to 7 different forces on the board at any one time. It's a game that starts 6,000 years ago, up until the internet is discovered. It does take a very long time to play. We tried to play through an entire game of this, starting at the first stage and going all the way through. And after 2 days of about 10-hour days, we finally gave up. We still probably had another 8 to 10 hours to go. This is a big, big game. Now, as a bonus, I'm going to talk briefly about two-player games. One of the things that's come out with these different types of Euro games are a number of two-player games. And pretty much every category of games I've talked about here, except perhaps party games, have two-player games as well. Lost Cities, for example, is a great two-player game about exploring, playing cards, and pressing your luck. Jumbo is a game about dealing with economic structure and trading things back and forth. Lord of the Rings, The Confrontation, is a great two-player game where you each have your sides hidden, kind of like the old Stratego game, good versus evil, and you're moving around the board. Shazam is a neat little two-player French game about that you're wizards casting spells at each other. Bonaparte at Marinego is a neat two-player military game that only takes, I don't know, an hour or so to play. It's a very clever little game. And then there's a whole series of abstract games. Yinch is one of the best ones that, again, are designed for two players. So for most of these categories I've talked about, there's some variant or different game out there you can play with, too. That was a lot. Hopefully you're able to keep up with me. If not, you can watch it again. You can check the Board Games with Scott site. You'll see some information. A listing of all these games will be there, so you don't have to rapidly scribble everything down. Hopefully you have a better idea of the range of games that are out there. So when someone says, hey, let's play Monopoly, you can say, I think there's some better choices for our gaming time, because we all don't have a lot of time. So hopefully what I can help you do with Board Games with Scott is to make better choices for that gaming time. So with that, I will see you later on another episode of Board Games with Scott. Thanks for joining me, and have fun out there. Bye-bye.